Two men were buried in Egypt around 1800 BC. The tomb was sealed. Nobody broke in. Nobody robbed it. For roughly 4,000 years, it sat perfectly untouched beneath the desert courtyard, while the world above it changed beyond all recognition. Empires rose. Empires collapsed. Languages were forgotten. Entire civilizations came and went. And that small room underground held everything exactly the way it had been left, waiting. When it was finally opened in 1907, scientists thought they understood what they had found. A matched pair of brothers, buried together, complete and preserved. Simple, clean, settled. They were wrong. What followed that opening is one of the strangest scientific journeys in the history of archaeology. A story where the bodies contradicted the coffins turned out to be right, scientists argued about it for 80 years, and the final answer came not from digging, but from the DNA hidden inside two ancient teeth. A story where a parasite living inside a mummified liver gave researchers the first hard genetic proof of a disease that still kills hundreds of thousands of people every single year. A story where everything that looked settled kept turning out to be more complicated and more extraordinary than anyone expected. And that journey is still not finished. Even now, more than a century after that sealed door was first opened, researchers keep going back and finding things nobody found before. This is the full story of the two brothers. And it starts not with a famous explorer or grand expedition, but with a man whose name almost nobody knows, finding something nobody was looking for, in a place nobody thought was worth a close look. The site was called Deir Rifeh. It sat in the middle of Egypt, roughly 250 miles south of Cairo, near a town called Asyut. It was a burial ground, a cemetery used by ancient Egyptians over many centuries. But Deir Rifeh was not glamorous. It was not Luxor. It was not the Valley of the Kings. It was a quiet, dusty stretch of desert that earlier treasure hunters and collectors had already picked through without finding anything much worth taking. That relative obscurity turned out to be exactly why the most important thing buried there had survived intact for 4,000 years. Nobody had ever thought it was worth a serious look. In January 1907, the British archaeologist William Matthew Flinders Petrie moved his excavation team to Deir Rifeh. Petrie was one of the most important figures in the entire history of Egyptology. Before Petrie, Egyptian archaeology was largely an exercise in trophy hunting. Wealthy collectors and their hired hands would dig up whatever looked valuable, pull it out of the ground, sell it, and move on. Petrie was one of the people most responsible for changing that. He introduced the idea of recording every object carefully, noting exactly where it was found, in what position, alongside what other objects. He was turning archaeology into something that looked more like actual science. He is widely credited today as one of the founders of modern archaeological methodology. And he brought with him to Deir Rifeh a student from the British School of Archaeology named Ernest Mackay, who helped oversee the practical work of the dig. But the actual discovery did not come from Petrie or Mackay. It came from an Egyptian workman whose name Petrie recorded in his own autobiography. The man's name was Erfi. He was clearing sand from the courtyard of a larger, more impressive tomb chapel at the site when he noticed something beneath his feet that did not fit. A smaller chamber tucked underneath the courtyard floor with every seal exactly the way it had been left thousands of years before. Not disturbed, not robbed, not touched, untouched. Finding an intact, unlooted burial chamber belonging to real Egyptian officials was already an extraordinary rarity by 1907. Egypt had been dug over for more than a century by then, and the chances of finding a room that had genuinely never been opened since the day it was sealed in antiquity were becoming vanishingly small with every passing decade. Petrie knew immediately what he was looking at. He did not pull it apart and sell it piece by piece, which was still common practice at the time. Instead, he wrote directly to the Manchester Museum in England, describing everything his team had found and asking whether the museum would take the complete group of objects together, rather than letting it get scattered across different private collections. The museum's committee said yes almost at once. A wealthy cotton merchant named Jesse Haworth, who had backed Petrie's work before, stepped in and helped raise the full amount needed within weeks. By the end of 1907, the entire contents of that sealed underground room had been shipped across the Mediterranean to Manchester, England, where they have stayed ever since. Inside that room, Petrie's team had found 2 complete burials packed tightly into a space built precisely for 2 people. Each burial had an outer rectangular wooden box coffin and an inner coffin carved and painted in the shape of a human body, covered in vivid painted inscriptions and images that had barely faded in 4,000 years underground. Inside those inner coffins lay the mummified bodies of 2 adult men. Alongside them sat 2 small wooden model boats, each one crewed by carved servant figures, because Middle Kingdom Egyptians believed the dead still needed to travel in the afterlife, and the model boats were their transportation on the other side. There was a painted wooden chest holding a complete set of 4 canopic jars, the containers used to store the men's preserved internal organs, which ancient embalmers removed during mummification. There were 5 carved wooden statuettes of the 2 men, and there were 2 pottery vessels. Every single object was present. Every seal was intact. Everything was exactly as it had been placed there by the people who carried out these burials around 1800 BC during Egypt's 12th dynasty, a period historians call the Middle Kingdom, one of the most stable and prosperous eras in all of ancient Egyptian history. Hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into the coffins gave researchers the names of the 2 men almost immediately. One was called Nacht Ankh, the other was called Khnum Nacht. Both inscriptions described them as sons of a local governor, referred to by his title rather than his personal name, which was a common practice in Middle Kingdom Egypt. Both inscriptions named their mother using the exact same name, Khnum Aa, 2 men, same mother's name on both coffins, buried together in a shared tomb with matching high-quality funerary goods that pointed to genuine wealth and real social standing in their community. The obvious conclusion was the straightforward one. These were brothers, full brothers, sons of the same father and the same mother, buried side by side. The tomb became known as the Tomb of the 2 Brothers. The men themselves became known simply as the 2 Brothers. That name stuck so firmly that it is still what almost everyone calls them today, even after everything researchers eventually discovered about who they actually were. That simple interpretation lasted less than a year. On May 6, 1908, the mummy of Khnumnakht was publicly unwrapped and examined in the Chemistry Lecture Theatre at the University of Manchester. The examination was led by Dr. Margaret Murray, who holds the distinction of being the first professional female Egyptologist in the United Kingdom, working alongside a small team of specialists she had assembled. This was not a quiet, private procedure. An invited audience of around 500 people from the Manchester Egyptian Association watched the unwrapping happen live in the lecture theatre. Public mummy unwrappings had happened before in Britain, sometimes as private curiosities for wealthy collectors, but rarely with this level of organized scientific documentation, and this large a public audience watching the actual procedure. Murray's team treated the event less like a spectacle and more like a genuine research opportunity. And historians who study the history of science now describe that afternoon as an important early milestone in the development of paleopathology, which is the scientific study of ancient disease and injury through human remains. The event was significant enough that it made local newspapers, including a write-up and photograph in the Daily Mirror just 2 days later. What Murray's team found when they worked through the layers of linen wrapping did not match what the coffin inscriptions had led everyone to expect. The skeletal shapes of the 2 men were different, significantly different, not slightly different the way any 2 brothers might be different enough that Murray's team concluded the 2 men showed no real evidence of a family relationship at all. Later, researchers examining the skulls in more detail described Nacht Ankh as showing features more typical of northern Mediterranean populations, while Khnumnakht showed features more typical of African populations from further south. Craniofacial analysis of this kind, measuring skull shape, jaw structure, and facial proportions, pointed the researchers firmly away from any shared bloodline. For the next 80 years, this skeletal mismatch became the accepted explanation among many Egyptologists. Some researchers proposed that one of the 2 men had been adopted into the family, which would explain how they could share a mother's name in the written inscriptions while appearing so physically different from each other under examination. The adoption theory circulated in academic writing about the tomb for most of the 20th century, treated as the most reasonable explanation available given what the physical evidence showed, even though nobody could actually prove or disprove it without a way to directly test the men's biological relationship. And for the entire time that argument was running, the DNA technology needed to settle it simply did not exist yet. Long before that technology arrived, something else turned up inside the 2 brothers that astonished researchers for entirely different reasons. Preserved tissue samples taken from inside their bodies still carried traces of a parasitic disease called schistosomiasis. It is caused by microscopic worms called schistosomes that infect the liver and intestines through contact with contaminated freshwater. The parasite's larvae live inside a specific species of freshwater snail and are released into the water, where they can penetrate human skin during activities like bathing, wading, fishing, or farming. Once inside the human body, the adult worms produce eggs that damage internal organs over time. Schistosomiasis remains one of the most significant parasitic diseases in the world today, affecting hundreds of millions of people across Africa, the Middle East, South America, and parts of Asia. The World Health Organization lists it as one of the world's most important neglected tropical diseases, responsible for enormous suffering and tens of thousands of deaths every year. Researchers had long suspected it had been a serious problem in ancient Egypt too, partly because the Egyptians lived so closely with the Nile, wading through its water to farm, fish, travel, bathe, and carry out religious rituals. In 2014, a research team led by Dr. Carney Matheson from Canada's Lakehead University analyzed liver tissue from Nacht Ankh and intestinal tissue from Khnumnakht, using PCR methods designed to detect ancient DNA. They found genetic evidence of Schistosoma mansoni, one of the parasite species responsible for schistosomiasis, confirmed independently by 2 separate laboratories working from the same samples. That confirmation was described in the subsequent published study as the first verified genetic report of this specific schistosome species ever recorded from ancient Egypt. They also detected genetic evidence of a second species, Schistosoma hematobium, in tissue from both men, suggesting each of them may have been carrying more than one form of the infection simultaneously at some point during their lives. The fact that parasite DNA survived inside tissue that had been sitting mummified for roughly 3,900 years is itself a remarkable piece of preservation. It tells researchers something concrete about the disease burden ancient Egyptians carried as part of ordinary life. If 2 high-status officials from a wealthy provincial family both carried schistosomal infection, it suggests the disease was not something that only affected the poor or the desperate. It was something you got from the river. And in ancient Egypt, the river was everything. Every drink of water, every bath, every farming season, every religious ritual that took place at the water's edge was potentially an exposure event. The infection was not a mark of poverty or carelessness. It was simply the cost of living in the Nile Valley. That 2014 study also gave researchers something unexpected. The same analysis that detected parasite DNA also examined the mitochondrial DNA from the 2 men's liver and intestinal samples, and its conclusions seemed to reinforce the doubt that had been building since 1908. The mitochondrial results in that study suggested the 2 men might not have shared the same mother after all, which would mean the coffin inscriptions were misleading or wrong, but this was where methodology became critical. The 2014 study extracted DNA from soft tissue samples. Soft tissue degrades much faster than the hard material inside teeth, and soft tissue is also much more susceptible to contamination from bacteria and from modern human DNA, both of which can corrupt ancient DNA results and produce readings that do not reflect the actual genetics of the original individual. The researchers who came later would argue that the 2014 results could not be fully trusted precisely because of those contamination risks. In 2017, researchers went back to the 2 brothers with a completely different approach. Dr. Roger Forshaw, a retired dentist with a research connection to the University of Manchester, carefully selected specific teeth from both mummies for sampling, making sure to take only teeth that were still firmly embedded in their sockets to guarantee each sample was coming from the correct individual. A loose tooth sitting in a coffin for over a century could have shifted position and ended up near the wrong mummy, but a tooth still locked in its jaw could only belong to the person it was found with. Those samples went to Dr. Constantina Droso at the University of Manchester's School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. Teeth are particularly valuable for ancient DNA work for a reason that makes good physical sense when you think about it. The hard outer layers of a tooth, the enamel and dentine, act almost like a natural sealed vault around the softer pulp inside. The genetic material trapped within that hard structure is shielded from bacterial degradation and from environmental damage far more effectively than DNA in any soft tissue. For remains as old as these, and from a climate as hot and dry as Egypt's, the hard case of the tooth may be the only structure in the entire body that has preserved usable genetic material at all. Dr. Drosu used next-generation DNA sequencing technology, the same class of sequencing methods that transformed modern medicine's ability to read genomes quickly and cheaply, to attempt to recover usable information from genetic material that was roughly 3,900 years old. She focused specifically on 2 distinct types of genetic evidence. The first was mitochondrial DNA, which passes down exclusively through the maternal line and carries a genetic signature that can be matched between individuals who share the same mother. The second was Y chromosome DNA, which passes exclusively from father to son and carries a separate signature that can reveal paternal lineage. She used a technique called hybridization capture to isolate these specific genetic fractions from the broader, badly degraded material inside the teeth, then put the captured fragments through sequencing to read what was actually there. The results, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in December 2017, gave researchers the clearest answer the question had ever received. Both Nakdank and Khnumnakt belong to the same mitochondrial haplogroup, a genetic marker designation called M1A1, meaning they almost certainly shared the same mother. That confirmed exactly what the coffin inscriptions had said all along. But the Y chromosome data told a different story. Though the Y chromosome results were less complete than the mitochondrial data, they showed clear genetic variation between the 2 men, strongly indicating that they had different fathers. Taken together, the results pointed to one specific biological relationship: half-brothers. 2 men who shared a mother but had been fathered by different men. Dr. Drosu described the process afterward as a long and exhausting journey toward a final answer, one that required considerable patience given how fragile and fragmentary the surviving genetic material was. The The study was recognized at the time of publication as one of the first studies anywhere to successfully type both mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA from Egyptian mummies simultaneously. That achievement mattered not just for the two brothers specifically, but as a proof of concept for future ancient DNA work on Egyptian remains, a category of remains that the hot desert climate and the chemical effects of mummification make particularly challenging for genetic analysis. After the DNA results came out, Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher from the University of York pointed out something that reframed the entire previous century of confusion. The coffin inscriptions had never actually claimed these two men shared a father. They named a mother for both of them. That was all. Identifying people through their mother's name rather than their father's name was not unusual in ancient Egyptian practice. It appeared in royal king lists. It appeared in the records of ordinary officials. It was a well-established tradition across many different types of Egyptian documentation spanning thousands of years of history. The inscriptions had not been hiding anything. They had not been misleading anyone. Researchers in 1908 simply assumed that sharing a mother's name automatically meant sharing a father too, and they built 80 years of debate on top of an assumption that the original documents had never actually made. 2 years before the DNA results arrived, the teeth had already yielded a separate set of discoveries through a completely different kind of analysis. In 2017, a research team went back to re-examine both men's teeth specifically for dental science, and those findings were published in the British Dental Journal in 2019. Both Nakhdonk and Khnumnakht showed the kind of heavy tooth wear that is typical of ancient Egyptian diets. The staple food in ancient Egypt was bread, and that bread was made from grain ground on stone, which inevitably left tiny particles of stone and sand mixed into the flour. Over a lifetime of eating that food, the grit in the bread acted like very slow sandpaper on the chewing surfaces of the teeth. Both men showed advanced wear consistent with this dietary pattern. Neither showed significant tooth decay, which matches what researchers expect in a population eating a diet very low in refined sugar, since tooth decay is primarily a consequence of sugar exposure. And ancient Egyptians had no access to the forms of sugar that drive modern dental disease. Khnumnakt's teeth revealed one particularly unusual detail. Researchers identified a rare developmental dental condition involving the fusion of one incisor tooth and the gemination of another incisor. Fusion happens when two separate tooth buds merge during development before birth and form a single wider tooth with features of both. Gemination happens when a single tooth bud tries to split into two teeth but does not quite complete the process, resulting in a tooth that appears partially doubled. The specific combination of both conditions in one individual was described by the researchers as likely representing the earliest documented example of this precise dental irregularity ever found in the archaeological record anywhere in the world. A condition that had nothing to do with disease, nothing to do with injury, and nothing to do with what Khnumnakht ate or drank. It was simply how his teeth happened to develop before he was ever born, encoded in him from the start, preserved for 4,000 years, and documented for the first time when researchers looked closely enough. Nakhdonq's teeth showed evidence of a tooth lost before death, with bone loss around the empty socket, suggesting the loss may have come from physical trauma, rather than from natural decay or disease progression. Dental trauma of that kind can result from a fall, a blow to the face, or any impact that puts enough force on a tooth to dislodge it. What caused it in his case, nobody knows. Dr. Campbell Price, curator of Egypt and Sudan at the Manchester Museum, published a critical re-examination of how the two brothers have been interpreted over the history of their time at the museum in 2023. His paper, published in a peer-reviewed journal, took the entire history of scientific investigation of the two men and asked a harder question than most previous researchers had asked. Not just what did we learn, but how did we learn it? What did our assumptions cost us? And what does the fact that we got the relationship wrong for 80 years tell us about the limits of the methods we were using? That kind of reflexive, honest look at a long case history is something archaeology does not always do well. And the two brothers' case offers one of the richest examples in the discipline of how scientific confidence and physical evidence can point firmly in a wrong direction for a very long time. Even with the DNA question settled and the dental analysis published and the parasite findings confirmed by independent laboratories, significant mysteries about these two men remain completely open. Nobody has ever identified what caused the death of either Nakht-Ankh or Khnumnakht. The dates of their deaths were actually recorded on their own linen wrappings, and the recorded dates place those deaths only months apart from each other, despite the fact that Khnumnakht died at around age 40, while Nakhdonq lived to around age 60. But no skeletal trauma, no pathological sign of fatal disease, no injury, and no other clear marker has ever appeared in any of the many examinations carried out on their remains across more than 100 years. Nakhdonq showed evidence of pleurisy, an inflammation of the lung lining, and also of a lung condition called sand pneumoconiosis, caused by inhaling fine desert sand particles over many years. Whether either of those contributed to his death remains unknown. Why Khnum-Nakht died 20 years younger than his half-brother, and what took him at 40 when the older man lived 2 decades longer, is a question with no current answer. Nobody knows the actual personal name of either man's father. The coffins name both of them as sons of a governor, identified by title alone, exactly as the ancient custom dictated, but without the name that would let modern researchers connect either man to any other known historical record. 2 real men with documented names, documented positions, documented family relationship, documented diseases, documented dental conditions, documented deaths within months of each other, but effectively fatherless in the historical record. And in 2023, additional Y chromosome analysis of Nakht-Ankh placed him within a genetic haplogroup designated H2, a small additional piece of genetic data that researchers are still working to interpret in the context of what is known about ancient population genetics in Middle Kingdom Egypt. The research continues. Even now, with every major technique of the last century already having been applied to these 2 men, new tools and new questions keep generating new results. More than 100 years after Erfai cleared the sand from that courtyard at Deir Rifeh and found a door that had not been opened since roughly 1800 BC, Nakht-Ankh and Khnum-Nakht remain 2 of the most thoroughly studied ancient Egyptians outside of actual royalty. The Manchester Museum has kept the complete tomb group together almost exactly the way Petrie originally intended when he first wrote to the museum in 1907. The coffins, the canopic jars, the model boats, the statuettes, the pottery, and the mummified bodies themselves are all still in Manchester, still together, still accessible to researchers with new questions and better tools. Every wave of new technology applied to the same 2 bodies over the decades has pulled out information nobody could have accessed before that technology existed. Radiocarbon dating, X-ray imaging, parasite DNA analysis, dental microscopy, next-generation genome sequencing. Each one added a genuine new layer to a story that started as a simple pair of painted coffins in an Egyptian courtyard and turned into one of the most layered, most carefully examined, most scientifically productive non-royal burials in the history of Egyptology. What the case of the 2 brothers ultimately demonstrates is something that matters far beyond these 2 specific men and this specific tomb. It demonstrates that certainty built on incomplete tools does not stay certain when better tools arrive. 80 years of scientific confidence pointed firmly and consistently toward the conclusion that Nakht-Ankh and Khnum-Nakht could not be biologically related. The skulls said it, the bones said it, the best methods available for most of the 20th century said it, and the coffins that had been sitting in Manchester all along, quietly naming the same mother on both inscriptions for over 100 years, were right the entire time. They were just waiting for science to catch up to what was written on them in 1800 BC. A sealed room held its secrets for 4,000 years. And it turned out the room was not keeping secrets at all. The answers had been painted on the outside of the coffins the whole time. It just took the rest of human history to figure out how to read them.